Picture this. It is the night of February 28th, 2026. Ramadan. Families across Tehran are breaking their fast, gathering in living rooms, lighting candles. Children are asleep. The city hums with the quiet rhythm of a holy month. And then, without warning, the sky splits open. 3 separate gatherings of Iranian regime officials are struck within 30 seconds of each other. 30 seconds, 3 targets. 3 simultaneous explosions ripping through the heart of the Islamic Republic at the exact same moment. This was not an accident. This was not a warning shot. This was a surgical, coordinated, meticulously planned decapitation strike. And it had been coming for years. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran, targeting military sites and government sites and assassinating several Iranian officials, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The surprise attacks were launched during negotiations between Iran and the United States regarding Iran's nuclear program. Let that sink in. During negotiations, while diplomats were still sitting at tables, while phone lines between Washington and Tehran were still open, the bombs were already in air. This wasn't just an airstrike. This was the most audacious military operation of the 21st century, and the man who had ruled Iran. With an iron fist for over 3 decades, the Supreme Leader who had outlasted every American president since George H.W. Bush was gone, dead, killed in a single night. The Israeli Air Force said that it had struck 500 military targets in western Iran, and central Iran in the largest combat sortie in its history. Israel later said its initial strikes used over 1,200 bombs. In 24 hours, 1,200 bombs in a single day. Think about what that number means. That is not a police action. That is not a targeted strike. That is the full, overwhelming, unrestrained weight of 2 technologically advanced militaries on Earth, crashing down on one country simultaneously. And the audacity of the execution was breathtaking. The night of strike. IDF leadership took their official cars home from IDF headquarters and came back without them, so satellite imagery would show. Their base did not appear full, nor warplanes appear armed and ready. They were hiding it in plain sight. Every spy satellite. Iran head was watching, and seeing nothing but a quiet parking lot. The Iranian regime never saw it coming. The initial dead included Iranian Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh and 4 top Ministry of Intelligence officials. The command structure fell fast. Of the Islamic Republic was decapitated in hours. The men who controlled the nuclear program, missiles, proxy networks, gone. And on March 1st, Iranian state media confirmed what the world already knew. Khamenei was dead. The IRGC controlled Fars News. Agency announced that Khamenei's daughter, son-in-law, grandchild, and daughter-in-law had also been killed. The government declared 40 days of mourning. But here is where the story turns dark. Because this wasn't a clean surgical strike against facilities alone. At least 20 civilians, mostly families who had gathered after breaking their fast at Ramadan, were killed in Tehran's Nilufar Square on March 1st or 2nd, according to Iranian state media. By March 3rd, the Iranian Red Crescent Society said over 600 civilians had been killed, while human rights monitors reported 1,097 civilian deaths. 1,097 dead in 72 hours, and Tehran wasn't done counting. By March 7th, the Red Crescent reported that over 6,668 civilian units had been targeted by U.S.-Israeli strikes, including 5,535 residential units, 1,041 commercial units, 14 medical centers, 65 schools, and 13 Red Crescent centers, schools, medical centers, residential buildings. Now, understand something. The governments of Israel and the United States say they targeted military infrastructure and regime leaders. They say civilian deaths were unintended. They say this war was necessary to stop Iran's nuclear program before the point of no return. And yes, Iran had been, enriching uranium, funding proxy armies from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq, and cracking down on its own people in protests, just weeks before the strikes. In January 2026, Iranian security forces massacred thousands of civilians in their crackdown on the largest Iranian protests since 1979. House of Commons, Library. This war did not begin on February 28th. It began long before. It began in the streets of Tehran, where young Iranians were dying for the right to exist freely. It began in the nuclear centrifuges spinning underground. It began in the missile depots pointed at Israel, at U.S. bases, at every American ally in the region. But February 28th is when the world changed. Because what came next, what Iran did, in response, is the story we are here to tell today. And it would push the entire planet to the edge of an economic catastrophe that historians will study for 100 years. Iran was wounded. Its leadership was gone. Its military was in chaos. And a wounded animal is the most dangerous thing on earth. They could not match America carrier for carrier. They could not match Israel bomb for bomb. They could not win in the sky, because the sky belonged to the F-35s and the F-15Es and the Raptors screaming over their cities at will. So Iran did something different, something ancient, something that no military superpower on earth had a clean answer for. They reached out and grabbed the world by the throat. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a major maritime choke point for world energy trade, was blocked, largely by Iran from February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched their air war. Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the strait. Mines. In the 21st century, they put actual sea mines in the water, the same weapon used in World War I. Because when you are outgunned in every conventional dimension, you don't fight conventionally. You fight dirty. You fight asymmetrically. You turn rules of the sea into a weapon, and it worked. The Iranian warnings and subsequent attacks on vessels prompted shipping firms to suspend operations in the strait. This caused a sharp decline in maritime transit, with tanker traffic dropping first by about 70% and then to approximately zero. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait to avoid risks. About 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were stranded in the Persian Gulf due to the closure. 20,000 mariners, 2,000 ships, trapped. Men and women sitting on vessels in the Persian Gulf, unable to move, unsure if a mine was beneath their hull, or a drone boat was approaching in the dark. Oil prices began moving like a rocket. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, rising to $126 per barrel at its peak. $126 a barrel. Think about what that does to every economy on Earth simultaneously. Every gas station, every airline, every factory, every farmer filling up his tractor, every family heating their home in a single month. Iran's revenge rippled through every corner of the global economy. And the attacks weren't just threats. They were real, brutal, targeted. On March 1st, the oil tanker Skylight was struck by a projectile north of Kasab, Oman, killing 2 crew members and injuring 3 others. The MKD Vyam was struck by a drone boat, sparking a fire and an explosion in engine room. An Indian sailor was killed. Real people, real deaths. Sailors from India, a country that had nothing to do with the strikes, whose only crime was working on the ships that kept the global economy alive, dying in dark waters. Of the Gulf of Oman, because Iran needed a weapon, and the sea was the most powerful weapon it had left. And then Iran twisted the knife further. On March 27th, the IRGC announced that the strait was closed to any vessel going to and from the ports of the United States, Israel, and their allies. And their allies. That phrase, think about who that includes. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada. Every NATO nation, every American partner. In the Indo-Pacific. In one announcement, Iran essentially declared economic warfare on half the civilized world. Iran's closure breaches. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea by denying transit in a strait used for international shipping. The placement of sea mines is seen as a violation of the Hague The Convention. International law shredded, and the consequences went beyond oil. The LNG disruption was also a problem for the production of fertilizer, impacting the agriculture industry in the Northern Hemisphere. The price shock and the shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce planting and yields of corn. In the United States, the main feedstock for U.S. beef, poultry, and dairy, and increase global food prices into 2027. It is estimated that global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher during the first half of 2026, if the crisis continues. Food. They weren't just threatening oil, they were threatening food. The corn that feeds cattle, the grain that feeds Asian cities, the fertilizer cycle that makes modern agriculture possible. Iran had found the single most vulnerable pressure point in the global supply chain, and they were pressing it with everything they had. Meanwhile, Trump was furious. On March 6th, President Trump said that only Iran's unconditional surrender would be acceptable and said the U.S. would attack Iranian energy infrastructure and bridges if a deal was not reached. House of Commons Library. Unconditional surrender, the language of World War II, applied to a country in the middle of the world's most critical shipping corridor. And then Iran did something even more audacious. It started charging tolls. When the ceasefire came, which we will get to, Iran began to control traffic through the strait and charging tolls of over $1 million per ship. $1 million per ship to pass through waters that international law says belong to the world. Iran had transformed the Strait of Hormuz into a toll booth, and there was nothing in the international rulebook that could stop them overnight. This was Iran's gambit, not missiles, not nukes. The sea, But America had a response coming, and it was going to be the largest. Naval mobilization since 2003. When America decides to send a message, it doesn't send an email, it doesn't send a diplomat, it sends 80,000 tons of steel armed with 90 fighter jets, nuclear capable and moving at 30 knots through every ocean on Earth. And this time, America sent 3 of them. For the first time in more than 2 decades, there are 3 aircraft carriers along with hundreds of Navy aircraft and thousands of sailors and Marines deployed to the Middle East. The last time the U.S. had 3 carriers in the area was during the U.S.-led Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Stars and stripes. Think about that. You have to go back 23 years to the invasion of Iraq, one of the largest military operations in modern history, to find a moment when America deployed this much carrier power in one region simultaneously. The last time 3 American carriers were this close together. In the Middle East, Saddam Hussein's regime fell within weeks. Iran was watching. The Gerald R. Ford CSG transited the Suez Canal, southbound on April 16th, once again entering the Red Sea and CENTCOM area of responsibility. The second carrier strike group, led by USS Abraham Lincoln, was operating in the northern Arabian Sea, enforcing the naval blockade of Iranian ports. The George H.W. Bush carrier strike group was transiting around the Horn of Africa en route to the Middle East, the war zone. The Gerald R. Ford, the most powerful warship ever built by human hands, moving down through Suez Canal into the Red Sea, the Abraham Lincoln locking down the Arabian Sea, and the George H.W. Bush taking the long route around the bottom of Africa, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, to avoid the Houthi-controlled choke point at Bab el-Mandeb Strait. 3 carriers converging on the same body of water from 3 different directions, like a slow, unstoppable vice. The USS Gerald R. Ford. Current deployment has now surpassed 295 days, marking the longest U.S. carrier deployment in the post-Cold War era, reflecting sustained demand for high-end naval power projection. Army recognition. 295 days at sea. These are not fresh crews. These are men and women who have been living on a floating city in a combat zone for nearly a year, sleeping beneath jet engine noise, eating mess hall food, watching the news from home on tiny phone screens while families wait. Wonder when they are coming back. And they kept going, because the mission demanded it. The impending arrival of about 6 more ships would put at least 27 Navy vessels, roughly 41% of the service's ships actively deployed and operating at sea worldwide. In the region, stars and stripes, 41%, nearly half of America's entire globally deployed naval fleet in one theater. Let that number breathe for a moment. While the rest of the world, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean beyond this conflict, has the other 59%, the Middle East is consuming almost half of American naval power to hold waterways. And they brought minesweepers. 2 Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, USS Chief and USS Pioneer, left Singapore on Friday, heading through the Strait of Malacca and into the Indian Ocean. Stars and stripes, because those mines Iran planted in Strait were not just a military threat, they were an existential liability. According to one report, Iran lost track of mines. It planted in the Strait of Hormuz, and is therefore unable to fully open the strait, even if it wanted to. Pause on that for a second. Iran laid mines and then lost them. The same weapons meant to give Iran leverage over the strait became a liability for everyone, including Iran itself. The hunters became the hunted by their own trap. And what was the message these 3 carriers sent to Tehran? Military analysts were crystal clear. Retired U.S. Navy captain Carl Schuster put it plainly, just the potential of a 3rd carrier getting involved adds to the pressure facing regime as peace talks approach. The message is that Trump may apply more pain if the peace talks don't advance the way Trump wants. The political imagery is as, and possibly more important, than the military action. CNN, political imagery as weapon, 3 carrier strike groups as a negotiating tool. This is 21st century gunboat diplomacy at its most extreme, except instead of a gunboat, it is a floating Air Force base with nuclear escorts. Multiple sources told CNN this week that plans were being developed for new strikes on Iranian targets in the Strait of Hormuz, in the event the ceasefire falls apart. They described potential attacks against small, fast attack boats, mine-laying vessels, and other asymmetric assets that help Tehran effectively shut down those key waterways. CNN, they already had the targeting packages ready, the coordinates identified, the strike plans drawn up. All they needed was the order. Iran's moves in the strait, the mines, the drone boats, the ship seizures, the toll collection, had forced America's hand into the largest naval mobilization of the 21st century. And the irony is devastating. Every aggressive act Iran committed in the water produced a larger, more overwhelming response that tightened the vice further around Tehran's economy. Iran's strikes weren't just backfiring militarily, they were backfiring strategically, economically, and diplomatically all at once. Iran thought it had the ultimate leverage: close the strait, choke the world's oil supply, extract concessions. But Trump had a countermove. No one in Tehran had quite wargamed to its conclusion: a counter-blockade. If Iran was going to seal the Persian Gulf exit, America would seal Iran's front door. Trump declared that the U.S. Navy would begin its own blockade of all ships trying to enter or leave Iranian ports from April 13th. And the results were immediate and brutal. U.S. Central Command confirmed that during the first 48 hours of the U.S. blockade on ships entering and exiting Iranian ports, no vessels had made it past U.S. forces. Additionally, 9 vessels complied with direction from U.S. forces to turn around and return toward an Iranian port or coastal area. Fox News. 9 vessels, 0 breakthroughs. In 48 hours, the American naval cordon was airtight. Every oil tanker, every cargo ship, every vessel trying to move Iranian goods in or out of the country stopped, turned around, sent home. On April 25th, U.S. naval forces intercepted the sanctioned LPG tanker LPG-7 in Central Arabian Sea, marking a clear extension of enforcement activity beyond the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel was assessed as part of Iran fleet and was carrying approximately 200,600 barrels of LPG. AIS and maneuvering data show the vessel was proceeding eastbound before executing a tight 180-degree turn at approximately 11:08 UTC, consistent with a compelled maneuver following interception by U.S. naval assets, reportedly involving a helicopter deployed from USS Pinckney, windward, 200 nautical miles south of Pakistan, in the open Arabian Sea. America was not just enforcing a blockade at the choke point, it was hunting. Iranian Shadow Fleet vessels across the entire Indian Ocean basin. No corner was safe, no Dark Fleet tanker could slip through. The enforcement had metastasized from a strait to a sea, and the economic math for Iran was brutal, according to analysts. Iran had 13 days of oil storage capacity, forcing it to shut down its oil fields thereafter and damaging them. The same analyst estimated the loss of import and export capacity to $435 million USD per day. $435 million every day. Gone. Meanwhile, both sides were exhausted and bleeding. On April 8th, a ceasefire was brokered, but it was a ceasefire in name only. Iran refused to reopen the Hormuz Strait, blaming Israeli strikes in Lebanon. After the failure of the Islamabad talks, Trump said he no longer cared about negotiations and announced a naval blockade. And America refused to give up anything for free. The resulting situation became what analysts called a dual blockade. The Guardian described the situation as a dual blockade. While the U.S. Navy was able to blockade Iranian ports, it had not been able to stop the Iranian blockade or open the strait to U.S. allies. 2 blockades, 2 choke points, 2 countries strangling each other simultaneously, and the world's shipping caught in the middle, oil prices spiking, LNG drying up, fertilizer markets panicking, food prices climbing. But then a crack appeared in Iran's strategy. A second ceasefire was announced, and within it, a surprising concession. On April 17th, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the Strait of Hormuz was open to all shipping traffic. Iran said the strait would remain open for the duration of ceasefire. In Lebanon, following the announcement, oil prices dropped sharply, losing 11% in the immediate aftermath. 11% in a day. Because the markets knew, they always knew, that this was never about military victory. It was always about economics, of pain. And when the pain relief appeared, even tentatively, the market exhaled. But the ceasefire was fragile. Days later, Iran showed it had no intention of going quietly. Iran's Navy on Wednesday said it had seized 2 container ships. In the Strait of Hormuz, shortly after the U.S. extended the ceasefire to allow Iranian leaders to submit proposal to end the war, the Revolutionary Guard Navy said the ships were seized for what it claimed were maritime violations. CNBC, 2 ships, seized during a ceasefire. Iran was sending a message: we are still here, we still control water. Your ceasefire does not mean our surrender. And the response from Washington was cold and immediate. White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt said, "The Iranians' desperation for a deal will only increase with President Trump's highly effective blockade, now in effect, which is sending oil tankers towards the big, beautiful Gulf of America." Fox News, desperate. That was the word the White House chose. And the intelligence supported it. Iran was running out of oil storage. It was running out of revenue. Its military had been degraded, its leadership decimated, its proxy network stretched thin. The ceasefire wasn't strength. It was a plea for time. And somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the USS George H.W. Bush was still moving. Toward the strait, the clock was ticking. Here is the brutal truth about what Iran attempted, and why it backfired so completely. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the strategic calculation in Tehran was this: the world needs our corridor more than America needs this war. Apply enough pain. To the global economy and the American public will demand Trump back down. Europe will beg for a deal. Gulf states fracture. China will intervene diplomatically. And Iran will emerge from the ruins of its leadership with the strait as bargaining chip. Permanent leverage over every cargo ship, every oil tanker, every LNG vessel that moves between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean forever. It was a brilliant gambit, and it failed at almost every level. Because the United States did not blink, it escalated, it sent 3 carrier strike groups, it launched a counter blockade, it intercepted sanctioned vessels. In the open ocean, 200 miles from Pakistan, it issued ultimatum after ultimatum, each one more severe than last. On March 22nd, Trump threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants if they did not completely open the strait within 48 hours. Obliterate power plants. That is not the language of a negotiation. That is the language of someone who has decided the cost of backing down is higher than the cost of continuing. And then came the isolation, because Iran's strategy required sympathy, required the world to see America as the aggressor and Iran as the victim defending its sovereignty. But Iran had picked the wrong weapon. You can get diplomatic sympathy for missile strikes. You cannot get sympathy for starving world energy, threatening global food supplies, and seizing civilian cargo ships flying neutral flags. On March 26th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that ships owned by 5 nations, China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Notice who is on that list: China, Russia, India, the countries Iran needed most. As diplomatic cover, the countries whose support at the UN gave Iran any hope of avoiding total isolation. Iran was allowing them through not as a gesture of restraint, but because it could not afford to lose them. It needed relations more than it needed the blockade against them, and India responded accordingly. The Indian Navy launched Operation Urja Suraksha as of March 25th, under which over 5 frontline warships, including destroyers and frigates, were deployed to region to escort over 20 Indian-flagged cargo ships that were west of Hormuz. India, a country that had tried neutrality, that had historical ties to Iran, that desperately needed Gulf oil, was now sending destroyers to escort its ships through a strait that Iran had mined. That is how badly the blockade had damaged Iranian standing even among friends. The nuclear talks, meanwhile, had become surreal. President Trump said that Iran had agreed to no longer enrich uranium. However, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization said Iran would not accept limits on its nuclear enrichment. Iran's foreign ministry said that uranium would under no circumstances be transferred anywhere. House of Commons, Library. 2 completely contradictory statements from the same country to the same negotiating table simultaneously. This is what desperation looks like. Saying yes to the American president while saying no to your own people, trying to buy time with vague commitments, while preventing domestic collapse by maintaining hardline positions at home. On April 25th, Trump said that he canceled American negotiators' trip to Pakistan for negotiations with Iran. On the same day, Trump said that the 2026 White House correspondents' dinner shooting would not stop him from winning the war in Iran. The negotiations were collapsing in real time, and the military pressure was not easing. It was intensifying. Bush's arrival coincides with a broader U.S. military surge that will bring total personnel in the region above 60,000. Stars and stripes, 60,000 American military personnel in one region. That is a number that dwarfs most standing armies on Earth, deployed in and around a body of water, the size of the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Now, here is what this all means for the world going forward. Because this story is not just about Iran and America, it is about the architecture of global power in 21st century. The Strait of Hormuz crisis of 2026 has proven, definitively, that the world's energy infrastructure is fragile. Until the war against Iran, the Strait of Hormuz was open, and about 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of LNG passed through it. One country, one strait, 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. And when that country decided to weaponize geography, the entire planet felt it within 72 hours. Every government on Earth is now having same talk. How do we build energy infrastructure that cannot be held hostage by a single regional conflict? How do we diversify away from corridors that a single determined actor can close? How do we re-engineer global food and energy supply chains to be resilient against exactly this kind of asymmetric warfare? These are not hypothetical questions anymore. They are emergency ones, because the scenario that energy economists called a tail risk, a low probability catastrophic impact event, It just happened. The tail became the dog, and Iran, which launched this gambit believing it would win through retreat or leverage, now is discovering that neither scenario played out. America didn't retreat. The leverage is slowly being strangled by blockade. The nuclear deal on the table demands zero enrichment for 20 years. The strait is technically open, but dangerous still, with mines unaccounted for and Iranian gunboats still patrolling. The Revolutionary Guard is now the most isolated force on Earth, with a dual blockade tightening around it, 3 American carriers visible on the horizon, and a White House. That has publicly threatened to obliterate its power infrastructure. Iran's strikes backfired, not partially, not in one dimension, across the board. The military strike on February 28th killed their leadership, but did not break their will, ignited it. The Hormuz closure damaged the world economy, but did not force retreat. It triggered a carrier surge, the ship seizures. During ceasefire, did not demonstrate strength. They demonstrated Iran could not hold the line diplomatically and militarily at the same time. And the nuclear talks have not produced a deal. They have produced a contradiction between messages. A wounded animal is dangerous, but a cornered, exhausted, isolated one, with 3 carrier strike groups between it, and the door is out of options. The Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, these are not just water. They are the arteries of modern civilization. And right now, today, April 27, 2026, they are the most contested, most dangerous, most consequential bodies of water on the face of the earth. Something massive entered the Red Sea, and the world will never look at these waters the same way again.